Singularity.
My name is Nicola, aka Socrates, and you're watching Singularity FM, the place where we interview the future. If you guys enjoyed this podcast, you can help me make it better in a couple of ways. Number one is you can go and write a brief review on iTunes, or you can simply go to interviewthefuture.com and make a donation. Today, for the third time in the history of our podcast, we have Canadian science fiction author and professional futurist Karl Schroeder. Karl is a fantastic author of a number of very interesting books that we have discussed previously. And if you guys are not familiar with him and his work, I highly suggest that you check out the previous two interviews that I have already done with him before. Because today we're going to focus on three general topics. First of all, we're going to invite Karl to enlighten us about how a professional futurist like himself looks at the future and the major trends that are happening. Then we're going to focus on one particular tool that futurists and foresight experts use that's called Strangemaking, and more specifically how Strangemaking can hopefully be applied in a productive or constructive way with respect to our current ongoing COVID-19 global pandemic. And finally, we would probably talk a little bit about the importance of narratives and so on. So, Karl, welcome back to Singularity FM.
Thank you so much for having me back. I've so much enjoyed the previous interviews, and I've been looking forward to this one.
Excellent, excellent. So we're going to challenge you a lot today, and you had to kind of think about what you wanted to tell us today. So hopefully, I believe, as always, you're going to have some mind-blowing ideas and suggestions for us all. But speaking about the previous interviews, I had a lot of feedback telling me that I have spoken a little bit too much, and that I have been cutting you off a little bit too much. And therefore, I would try to shut up a lot more this time. I will do my best to give you a lot more of the podium than I've given you before. And so, let us start with perhaps the fundamentals of futurism and the way a professional like you, applying the principles of foresight, looks at the present and the trends and what it tells us about the possible futures that we may be witnessing.
Sure. About 100 years ago, just as quantum mechanics was coming on the field, Western society was sort of steeped in the idea of determinism, the idea that if you, for instance, knew all the positions of all the particles in the universe and had the right equation, you could just project forward and know what was going to happen. As a science fiction writer, I'm of course, familiar with the classic book about that, Isaac Asimov's Foundation, in which someone actually comes up with the equations for history and is able to project forward to find out what is going to happen. And this is a great idea, and early futurists were quite interested in the idea of predicting the future, because we've been trying to predict the future for thousands of years using chicken bones and yarrow sticks and all manner of things. My favorite one is extispicy, which is the examination of the intestines of cattle that have been hit by lightning. Yeah. So over the aeons, we've come up with all kinds of techniques to try and see the future, because the problem is that the future seems to be impossible to know, but it's also absolutely necessary to know. And we as humans are trapped in this dilemma. So the idea that there could be a rigorous science discipline to do this was very exciting. And to some extent, you can predict the future. For instance, I can tell you exactly what time the sun will rise on August the 14th, 3055. That's physics. And there are a lot of physical processes that are absolutely predictable. But they're not actually the ones too interested in these days. We've already nailed that. We know when to start planting our crops, which was why we built Stonehenge and other astronomies back in the day. We figured that stuff out. What we don't really understand is how to predict human beings. And we also don't understand how to predict sudden shocks like the COVID-19 virus. But for a while, people thought maybe they could. So early futurists styled themselves as systems thinkers, following all the paths and flows of energy and people and so forth in society, and tried to project those ahead. To some extent, again, we can still do this. Systems thinking is extremely valuable. But the main thing that we've learned over, I'd say, the last 40 years ago or so, is that the things that we really care about are the things that are fundamentally unpredictable, because we don't live in a deterministic universe, as it turns out. We live in one in which various different agents of change are all acting simultaneously. And while we can look at trends, and while we can look at innovations and things like that, we can't actually say what is going to happen. This has given rise to a new and I think much more mature form of foresight that doesn't concern itself so much with prediction. So when I tell people that I'm a futurist, they often say, "Oh, predict something for me," and I say, "No, that's not what I do." There's something much important that foresight does, and that's prepare people and organizations for the unpredictable. In other words, we're here basically to inoculate you against change, or even more, to put it even more concisely, to inoculate you against surprise. Foresight has become the science of surprise. And what I try and do is I try and see what surprises could be out there, but more importantly, how people and the organizations that they are in are prepared for surprise, how resilient they are, how quickly they can turn, and how many options they have open to them. And try and inoculate them against surprise, and give them the tools to, for instance, surprise their competitors, which is an equally valuable tool.
So, what are the fundamental tools to inoculate oneself, whether individually or collectively, as a corporation, organization, a state, or a simple citizen, or a professional? What are the fundamental tools or principles that would allow us to even attempt doing that?
Well, one of the most fundamental tools for inoculating yourself against change is to recognize what your default future is. In other words, to recognize the things that you don't think can change, or that will change. We all walk around with a vision of what the world is like in our head. And part of that is a vision of what is going to happen. And what I've learned in the last 4 months, the entire world, is that vision can be toppled instantly, without warning. Or even though we were warned against pandemics many, many times, without our recognition of the possibility. And it's that lack of recognition that is the issue. It's not that pandemics weren't predicted. prediction, even if it were possible for something like this, is not really the issue. It's the presence of that default assumption that it's not going to happen. Not this year, not on my watch, not in this company, not for this country. We can be presented with all kinds of predictions and possibilities. But if our default future doesn't contain the possibility of change, particularly those kinds of changes, then there's nothing we can do. So the very first thing we have to do is recognize the blind spots that we already have.
Okay, and then where do we go from there? And by the way, speaking of sort of like change and like we have this term now that's being thrown all over the place. New normal. Some people call it post normal. To me, that kind of sounds strange. And tell me if I'm right or wrong here, or because to me there's never been something like really like normal. I mean, take any epoch in the history of the last 10,000 years. Which one is the normal one? Even in the last 100 years, change is the normal. So when
Yes.
people say, well, the new normal, what's different here? I don't get it. Like, it's change. That's normal. So the new normal is just like the old normal. It's change. That's what's normal. The not normal thing is not change. Okay. So if we live in a dead universe where nothing happens, that would be a new normal compared to our current normal for the last 14 billion years, which is stuff happens all the time, everywhere in the universe, constantly. That's my take on it. It's like, what do you think?
Yeah, no, I agree with you. The issue with the new normal and with normal is again around surprise. So the pandemic was a big surprise, but now that it's here, we're living sort of past the surprise. We're moving past the stage of being surprised, and that's what people I think mean when they refer to it as the new normal. What's not normal is surprise. And what is normal is even the weirdest of situations that we might be living in. Changes that we are aware of. I mean, one way to look at this is that we imagine that we have a language, a grammar for describing the world around us. And it has words and it has sentences that you can build with those words. And we can combine those things in all kinds of ways to describe the world. And then something comes along that we don't have a word for. For a while, what we feel is just a sense of disorientation. Something's different, but we literally can't describe it. So it's not part of our mental landscape. It's this period of disorientation that we lived through, and to some extent we're still living through now as we adjust. In the long run, we'll come up with new words, new language that we understand for these things. But there's that phase when something is happening, but we don't have the language for it, and therefore can't recognize it and bring it into our conversations. That is incredibly important for us to be aware of. And you're right, change is happening all the time. So therefore, we're getting little doses of these kinds of new things all the time. But normally it doesn't overwhelm us because we can just revert back to our, the full scale grammar that we have and talk around things. The pandemic doesn't allow us to talk around it. So it's what the philosopher Alain Badiou calls an event, something that is a discontinuity, a complete break from what we've had before. And we have to invent new ways
of a.
It is quite literally, yeah. So we have to invent new language to be able to deal with it. But we can proactively invent language for things that have not occurred yet. One of the tools we use to do that is science fiction. So we have words like terraforming. Terraforming has never been done. There is no science of terraforming. There isn't an institute of terraforming. People don't get degrees in terraforming. And
Not
so on
consciously.
And so forth.
I mean, you can say that everything we've done to the planet for the last 10,000 years has been terraforming, but it's not been. I mean, global warming is terraforming, right? But it's not been designed or sort of deliberate or conscious. It's been just like a byproduct of what we've been doing in a way. Isn't that make sense?
That is exactly what I'm saying. What you've just done is shown how a term that was invented for something that doesn't exist can suddenly become relevant and applicable to the situation that we're in. Even though there's no institute for terraforming, and there's no science of doing it, we're suddenly realizing that, oh, we understand this idea, we understand this word, and we can see that we're doing it. Without that word, we would be lacking part of our grammar for understanding global warming and the situation that we're in. So part of what futurism does is try and find new terms and terminologies, new language for describing things that don't necessarily yet exist, but which kind of are like new tools in our toolkit. And when we need them, we can reach in and pull them out.
That's fantastic. Yeah, and we'll come back later to the topic of the importance of language when we move on to narrative. But so let's say we've recognized the fact that we would be surprised, that predicting the future is impossible, and that our so-called norm or model or normal will be disrupted. And on our watch, on our shift, that will happen. So let's say you're hired by the Canadian government or by one of the major corporations which are struggling right now. I don't know, 3 or 4 months ago. How would you lay down the principles or the steps after or the tools they can use together with you under your guidance after that first step that you said we all have to begin with?
Well, you have to know what the organization wants, right? For a foresight engagement, they generally don't come out of the blue. They're typically about the strategic plan for the organization. So, for instance, work that I've done for the Canadian military was primarily about preparing junior officers to become colonels and generals 30 years down the line. So what they wanted to do was they wanted to lay the seeds now for the thinking that these people would need to be able to do 25 years from now.
So let's say I'm the president of the United States and I have the foresight to come and hire Karl Schroeder because I think you're the best. And I tell you, Karl, how does the United States enter the 2020s? What would your expertise in foresight help me do or see or prepare for? What kinds of steps should I take? What kind of things should I watch out for? Help me out.
Well, you want to know what your expectations are about the future. So you want to know what your default future is. What do you think can't change?
Well, the United States has to be the best, most powerful militarily, politically, economically country. We want to retain our global dominance, of course.
Well, that's a goal, which is a little bit different from your default assumptions. But a clearly defined goal like that is often necessary for a foresight engagement. Okay, so that's the strategic aim. Um, Now you can sort of see that foresight is actually only one part of, in this case, a planning process. So it falls at a particular step in the strategic planning uh, sort of workshop or project that you're in. And typically, this is exactly how it works. You've got a strategic planning operation that you're doing, and it involves many different parts, including assessing what your competitive landscape looks like, um, what your goals as an organization are, what the industry as a whole looks like. Foresight comes in basically in the middle of that to interrogate your assumptions and to create a spectrum of possibilities. And this is where we don't do the predicting. You say, this is what's going to happen. You look at trends, you look at possible discontinuities. By interrogating your assumptions, you can say, well, maybe there'll be a pandemic, right? What will happen if all the cars go off the road for 4 months? Let's say we're talking to the oil industry, right?
That's impossible, Karl. That could never happen. It's
Right.
never happened. Even in the
Sure.
1970s oil embargo, we still had cars on the road, and it could never happen. It's impossible.
Right. And we get that a lot, right? Because that is the default future. The default future contains nothing that doesn't already exist, usually. And impossible is the word that's most often used. This can't change. So you go looking for ways in which it might actually be changing, and you explore ways that it could change. And then you ask, what could you do if it did change? In other words, what's your current state of resilience? Are you able to sustain a shock like that? So for a lot of organizations, or for instance, Canadian provinces who are invested in one primary
like Alberta
industry,
in the oil sands.
yeah, you ask, well, what would happen if this crashed? Are you diversified? Do you have a plan for diversification of
Clearly,
the
they're
economy?
not.
Well, they've had many opportunities, and they've done a lot of work towards that. And in fact, Alberta has, if not the most, futurists working in government. It's got a lot of professional futurists, very, very good ones. And they do this kind of exercise. Yeah. Yeah. So
why do I not get the vibe that they've been prepared at all for any change or pushing for any change for the last decade? But they've been basically, instead of forward looking, that's my sort of non-professional, partial and skewed subjective personal observation, is that they've been stubbornly refusing to look forward into the future, but stuck in a sort of late 19th, early 20th paradigm that they're refusing to move away from. That's my view.
Well, what I would say to that is, who's this they that you're referring to? Because uh, right. So this brings us to a really, really important part of foresight, which is, who is your customer, and how much power does your customer have? Usually, foresight is brought into an organization by some kind of internal champion, somebody who believes in the process, understands it, and can see the need for building that kind of resilience. And as a foresight professional, you may be brought in to do workshops, to create scenarios, all kinds of things. But the fundamental question in the end is, at what level are you speaking? Are you talking to some line manager who has a budget that they need to spend, who brought you in? Or are you talking to the CEO who actually has the power to implement changes?
Just listening to the speeches Jason Kenney's been giving for the last 3 years, and even before that with the NDP government, their position was not that much different with respect to oil and so on.
Sure. And that speaks to where, at what governmental level foresight is being done and what is being done with the results, right? And as a foresighter, as a futurist, you don't control that. Unless you set yourself up as a public pundit, like Alvin Toffler did, for instance, and speak to the whole planet, and somehow manage to get everyone's attention. Future Shock, both as a book and as a concept, was designed to do that. Basically to make an end run around organizational structures. If everybody in your companies bought the book, or at least knows how to have a water cooler conversation about it, you as the CEO find it a lot harder to dismiss the ideas that go along with it. So as part of a foresight project, you don't have any more control over the outcome than any other person involved in strategic planning. Take a strategic planning exercise that is entirely now-based, based on, say, a competitive analysis or a blue ocean analysis of where other companies in your space are at. The odds of you getting that implemented at the top level are the same as the odds of a set of foresight scenarios being acted upon. So there has in the past been a lot of acceptance at high levels in Canada for foresight. Again, in the military, it's never gone away. 20 years ago, the National Science Council had a foresight arm that was run by Jack Smith, who was my mentor and who single-handedly sort of built that capacity. Well, not single-handedly. I could name a lot of different people who contributed, but Jack was instrumental to bringing together all kinds of Canadian stakeholders at high levels of government. Unfortunately, successive governments dismantled that capacity. Yes, there's all kinds of things that can interfere in real politic terms with foresight getting done. But because that's entirely out of my control, that's not something that I, typically worry about. I worry about my ability to communicate and educate the people that I'm actually working with.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk about so you have a number of tools which allow you to sort of like perceive and evaluate and maybe even inform and guide you as per what to do within different possible scenarios. And one such tool that we touched upon during our previous conversation was Strangemaking. So can you perhaps share with us, first of all, what is Strangemaking in general?
It's usually got two components to it. It's deeply wrapped up with what I've actually been talking about the default future. And the first part is learning to make the familiar strange. So making people wake up to just how out of equilibrium their situation might be. You might think it's normal for a city of 4 million people to be pouring immense amounts of gasoline into their cars and all of them driving past each other in various different directions, miles and miles away from where they live, to work for 8 hours and then all jumping in their cars and driving all the way home. But when you're immersed in that lifestyle, you don't see it. So finding a way to get people to see that is the first component. The pandemic has done that. It has strange-made commuting for us. Suddenly, we're recognizing that this was an odd, out of whack situation that we were living in all along, right?
Maybe even
The second
obsolete
part,
in many ways.
yes. Well, it could be now, but that's sort of the next stage in our thinking, right? But the next step is to make the strange familiar. So once you've opened the door to the possibility that things could be different, you enable so many options for people. To get to those options, they have to be able to imagine the world as different. And normalizing those differences is the other part of strange making. So when I talked about terraforming earlier, that's an example of taking the strange and making it familiar. The specific move in that case is to say, oh, we have been terraforming the Earth using fossil fuels. That's a strange making move that takes what was unfamiliar and normalizes it.
Mm-hmm. So let's take the current ongoing COVID-19 global pandemic. And you said maybe we didn't recognize it. Most of us didn't. And even like we did our previous interview, I think it was, what was it, March 5th, 4th, 5th, somewhere thereabouts. And
Yeah.
we were sort of just at the very beginning. And I mentioned it a couple of times briefly, but we never focused on it. And I even had conversations with other people that, it's inevitably going to come here and it's going to be bigger than we expected. But I never even recognized how big it will be.
Mm-hmm.
And we didn't kind of cover it sufficiently. So let's see now, first of all, what can we learn by the surprising emergence of this previously unrecognized future that is now our present, called COVID-19 global pandemic? And secondly, how can we strange make, or what can we make out of it now that we're here?
Yeah. There's an old saying in science fiction. It's been attributed to several people. It might be Larry Niven who said it first. That the science fiction writer's job is not to imagine the automobile, but to imagine the traffic jam. And in the case of a global pandemic, what we were able to imagine was the automobile. Basically, we were able to imagine the fact of it, and how a global health response might play out on the institutional level. But what we couldn't imagine was that we might walk out at 8 a.m. On a sunny day in a city of, again, this one is about 3.5, 4 million people, and hear nothing but birds, and look up and see a perfectly blue sky. We didn't connect the idea of a pandemic with the idea that wildlife would be penetrating the cities, or that people would be walking down the middles of the road, or that people would be enjoying this quiet and finding something there that they had forgotten that they'd lost. So the strange for the pandemic for us has almost by definition come from unexpected directions. It's come from the first 3 weeks of the toilet paper crisis. To predict the pandemic meant, if you were really going to do it, to predict that people would be hoarding toilet paper and ignoring all the food on the shelves. In the usual zombie apocalypse scenario, it's the other way around. You get people camping out in fortresses with mountains of canned goods. No, that's not what happened. And it's the things that were expected that didn't happen that are really our indicators for how to look at change. There hasn't been mass panic. There has been an immense outpouring of community spirit and community support. Things like this.
Well, but there's been a lot of resistance too. You have armed militias storming the state government in a number of states in the United States, basically. I mean, thankfully without like any actual violent, armed confrontation. But basically the police let them kind of march in. And they were very heavily armed with assault rifles and tons of ammo and you name it. And even in Washington, D.C., we had lots of anti-quarantine demonstrations. Michigan was, of course, the most probably the prototypical, most notorious place. But that happened all over. You give us a very kind of optimistic take, and I'm happy to hear that. But there were a lot of darker elements that emerged too, I think.
Oh, sure, absolutely. I'm not denying that at all. Although people have a tendency to think in post-apocalyptic terms in an entirely negative way, which was part of my point, that a lot of the bad stuff that was expected did not happen. Now, with regard to those protesters, and I think it's Minnesota, what they've discovered is that when they went home, they took COVID-19 with them, and now it's breaking out in rural communities where otherwise it would have taken a long time. Yeah, it would otherwise take a long time to get there. But for Foresight, that again is a really good example. You might predict the protesters, but the important thing would have been to predict the outbreaks that they would cause when they went home. Because a proper foresight-based reaction or plan around those protesters would have said, well, let's ignore the protesters, but let's go to rural Minnesota and build a pandemic plan there because we know they're going to bring it back with them. That's the important thing, not the protest. The protest is just a protest. But people are going to die in rural Minnesota, and that is life and death.
Yeah, that's very, very sad. But let's say if we can call the global COVID-19 pandemic the car, then what would be the traffic jam that we should have predicted with the help of Foresight? Or now that it's easier because we already have the car in the shape of a pandemic, what will be the equivalent of the traffic jam that we should see, that we must see from this situation?
Well, I think there's going to be a lot of things. One of them is the collapse of fossil fuel industries. The dominant narrative is still that they're going to recover, and in fact, yes, they will. We do need to get back on the road, but there's going to be far, far fewer of us. Twitter, for instance, has just announced that it's making work at home an option
Forever.
for all its employees forever. Yeah. A lot of other companies are going to follow suit. So there will be a massive impact on commercial real estate for the long term. And that, again, is something that should have been built into pandemic response plans. I don't know that it was. The fossil fuel industries are basically resting on top of at least $1 trillion worth of stranded assets This is oil and gas that can never be burned, because if it was burned, the global temperature would shoot above intolerable levels. But their valuations as companies have depended on these assets. One of the things that's going to happen, even once we all get back on the road, is that those stranded assets are going to be considered stranded. So there's going to be $1 trillion write-down of the values of these companies, even if we all go back to our commuting lifestyle. And knock-on effects like that are what are really, really difficult to predict. And again, if your aim is to predict, then the traffic jam is really hard to see in advance. But what you can do is you can come up with what we call scenarios, particularly wildcard scenarios. And that's always a plural. There's always more than one.
So give us several wildcard scenarios, perhaps.
Well, we're living in one. We're living in the ultimate wildcard scenario for the beginning of the 21st century. It's when something completely unexpected comes in and changes the entire nature of the situation. So, first contact with an alien civilization is a wildcard scenario. For energy, a wildcard scenario is the sudden invention of cheap nuclear fusion, for instance. The problem with wildcard scenarios, no, not by itself, because everybody expects it. And is planning for it. So not by itself. It's the thing that it's out there, and you may know about
genetics
it.
Like CRISPR, genetic manipulation such as CRISPR would also fall under that sort of like expectation, therefore not really a wild card.
Not by itself. Again, it's something that might happen because of CRISPR that could be a wild card.
Could be the wild card. Yeah. Right. So for instance, with AI, go ahead.
For instance, a genetically tailored disease. So a new pandemic that was artificially created, unlike this one, which is natural.
Mm-hmm. Or, for example, some kind of a wild card potential scenario as a byproduct of the invention of AI. Give me one possible candidate for that.
With regard to AI?
Yes.
I have one that I'm working on right now with a Foresight group that I can't talk about. I really want to. Let's see, what else can I talk about? The
second best. Give us your second best.
Again, because wildcards really are about what you're not thinking about. I wouldn't even go to AI. I would go to something else, like, for instance, astrophysics discovers that the universe, or that the Big Bang was not the beginning of the universe, that in fact the universe is cyclic, eternal, and will repeat as happening. This is just one of an endless cycle of repeating universes. Now, this is something that could have a effect on society, on religion, on how we view ourselves as human beings, right?
Basically, Hinduism will become physics.
Right. And that sort of thing is absolutely not that particular case, but that kind of a discovery is an absolute possibility that we have to be aware of. So when we strange make our near future, let's say that we're dealing now with a future in which we understand ourselves to be living in an eternally recurrent physical universe. Another good example would be integrated information theory, which is a new candidate for a theory of consciousness, theory of the mind. What is really interesting about IIT is that it purports to be able to allow you to instrumentally and mathematically distinguish between a conscious system and a non-conscious system. So you can design two computers, and they both talk to you. They're both AIs, and they both seem to be conscious. But you can prove that one of them is, and the other one is just pretending. Not only that, you can say with absolute certainty that your cat or dog or the cattle that are marching into the slaughterhouse have minds and conscious experiences. So again, what does that do to society? Does this make everyone into vegetarians, or does it start a war over the rights of animals, for instance? This, again, is something that is an absolute possibility based on science that's actually out there in the wild right now. And yeah, it creates a wild card situation.
So, as you said, we are living in one of those wild card situations right now. And last time when we were talking about your book, we were talking about some examples about a freedom within limits, and how, as you said, we have infinite possibilities or infinite degrees of freedom within a very narrow actually range of actions or possible futures that we can sort of go along. And how we were talking about the example of a hammer, which is always perceived as a hammer until it's broken, and then suddenly you have the possibility of perceiving it as something different, of using it for something different, and of seeing it in a totally new light. So let's see if or how maybe we can take that kind of reasoning and learning and adapt it, if we can, to our current COVID-19 situation. What is it that got broken, and what is it that we have new freedom to do today that we didn't have before?
Well, it's pretty clear what got broken, and at least in places like the United States, and that was the naive idea of personal freedom. So when all those protesters went out and said, well, you can't make me not go to work, they didn't realize that they were not arguing with other human beings about this. They were arguing with an agent, a non-human agency, loose in their environment, that was trying to kill them. But
that's no laughing matter. But I'm sorry. Yeah.
No, but I think that we talked about last time the fact that one of the theories of change that people often have is that change happens because people make things change. And if a person doesn't make something change, then it doesn't change. Ergo, if something changes, it's because somebody made it change. And therefore, if COVID-19 is raging across the planet, it's because somebody made it happen. It was developed in a lab by this logic. It was allowed to flourish, or it is a political tool. It doesn't really exist, but people are saying that it exists. This kind of thinking leads you to view the universe as consisting of nothing but human beings and their various political ploys. And in that case, COVID-19 is nothing but another political ploy. So you fight back against that the way you always fight back, by protesting, right? By blaming, by all the normal strategies. The problem is that you're not dealing with that kind of an agent of change. So these guys are going to get sick. They're going to go home and they're going to pass on the sickness to their own loved ones. It's a tragedy. And it's a tragedy that's nobody's fault. So that was, the hammer breaking sort of moment for a lot of people. But the question of what can change positively, well, I think we're seeing that already, that people are talking in many countries about the economic recovery having to be a green recovery. That this is a historical moment in which, because everything's shut down anyway, we can restart our institutions in different configurations. Yes, we absolutely can, because so much of the world that we live in is a consensus reality. It's the world that we agree exists. Now we have the chance to restart it with a new agreement in place.
I agree with you, but the problem is that it seems to me that that's not necessarily the agreed narrative or consensus, and that will be our next topic. But just to grab that thought here and focus on it for a second, is I'm not convinced that Alberta in any way, shape, or form wants to sort of like go green right now. I hope I'm wrong, and I hope that they would. And I hope they use this tremendous opportunity to do just that, because Calgary is like the highest solar powered. The city of Calgary receives the highest amount of solar energy per square meter than any other city in Canada, just to give you one example. Mm-hmm. And yet that means nothing to them, it seems to me. And it's not, I haven't seen it as part of the official provincial narrative or discourse or even as debate. It's all about basically give us the support and the money to basically resurrect the oil and gas industry and bring back the previous normal, the bring back time, basically. That's what they're trying to accomplish. Despite, and Fort McMurray is a great example of that. It's been burned, it's been flooded right now, it's been under quarantine, and yet every time it's the same exact story. Let's rebuild exactly as we were before, instead of like, well, maybe we shouldn't be building here if we're in a floodplain and if we're like in the path of a forest fire, and we know with global warming there will be more flooding and there will be more forest fires than ever before. So maybe it's not such a smart thing to rebuild exactly the same as it was before, but yet that's what we keep pushing for, at least there, and that's what we keep getting. And I mean, even Trudeau bought the pipeline and is now giving billions of dollars to those companies. So I'm.
Well, you realize what you're doing, though. You're describing your default future. You're telling me what's impossible.
Well, I am afraid that.
But can I continue though? Sure, and that's part of the default future is based on everything we've seen so far. We're not going to get a pandemic, right? So, but the other part of it is that you're absolutely right. No, people are not going to agree. The whole world is not going to suddenly link hands and sing Kumbaya and march down this path. No, some places will and some places won't. When we talk about the future, when we talk about trends, we always talk about trends and counter trends. Things that are going one way and the forces that are pushing back or are going the other way, because there are always movements in both directions. You need to take that into account. It's normal. That's a normal part of foresight to be aware of both trend and counter trend. All I was saying in this case was that this is the opportunity. And a lot of places, a lot of jurisdictions, whether they're national or urban, for instance, are very vocally recognizing and signing on to the opportunity for change. Will there be resistance? Of course there will. But that doesn't mean it's not going to happen. It's just like, as Gibson has said, this future will be here, but not evenly distributed. I'll tell you one place it's not going to happen: Brazil. Bolsonaro is taking Brazil, entirely down the wrong path.
Yeah.
Although, it may result in a coup or a revolution if things get bad enough. And maybe they'll go green faster than anybody else. We cannot predict. The point is not to predict, but to understand how would we deal with a Brazil still ruled by Bolsonaro, and how could we prepare for a Brazil that had actually turfed him out and gone green suddenly. These are scenarios. These are options, and we have to recognize the possibility of each of them.
Well, Karl, we are getting towards the end of our conversation here, so let me just bring in the power or the importance of the narrative, of the story, when it comes to this kind of, especially strange making or scenarios, and because each scenario that you're talking about in Foresight is basically another story. It's basically a story, and a wild card is basically a story that we didn't think of, or we didn't think it was important, or we didn't think it's going to be possible, right? Those are just wild card stories, right? So talk to me, and it seems to me that right now, and I would love if Calgary and Alberta in general becomes a wild card in this kind of opportunity that you're telling us, and I totally agree with you. We live in right now to break through, to break apart from the past and sort of create a new green new deal, if you will, as so many, as you pointed out, are pushing for. But if they have this dominant story that's from the past, isn't it the case that the first step to break through, to break apart from the past, is like coming up with a new story and somehow selling it to the people, selling it to the companies, selling it to the leaders, selling it to the decision makers, right? And in a way, if you can say the crisis that we live in right now is maybe arguably not really a climate crisis as much as a climate of a consensus about a common story, right? Because one group of people says, well, we live in a climate crisis. Other people say, no, that's the story of the invention of the left, who are trying to impose their radical leftist agenda on us, or something like that. And there's a bunch of different stories, obviously, in between them. But so you could say that, it's harder and harder to make sense of life because everything is changing all the time at a faster and faster pace, and our civilization is trying to react to and keep up with all kinds of exponential changes and pandemics and everything that's happening, maybe because we lack this narrative that could accommodate for, explain, and inform us maybe even about what can we expect and what we can do about those things, right? Where's the narrative coming here? Where's the storytelling coming in here?
Well, a lot of people are working on just that. And there is, in fact, a new discipline in design called transition design, which is all about designing or finding the appropriate language to describe positive changes that we need to make. And that language is almost inevitably narrative. Discursive design is another very recent development in design. And so a lot of people are working on it. And yes, narrative is central to this because while humans have developed many, many different techniques over the millennia for describing regular processes in nature, mathematics being the ultimate tool for that, we have also in parallel developed one tool specifically designed for describing unique events, and that is narrative. Narrative is what we use to describe things that basically agent-based changes that
Everything.
can only be no specific kind of changes that can only be understood in terms of history and context. So a tornado, for instance, we understand tornadoes in an abstract sense, but any given tornado, it has a story of where it touched down, what it threw around, the path that it took, the specific damage that it caused. That is the story of that particular tornado. And while we may understand, broad historical changes like recessions and so forth, or even pandemics, the only way that we can properly understand any given one is to tell its story. So what a lot of people are trying to do right now is tell new stories about the future, and I'm doing that as well. I'm interested in the story of the civilization that comes after ours. And I'm interested in that story not being the triumphalist, colonialist, space colonization future in which we master science and technology and pave the earth. And I am interested in that story being a triumphal story for humanity at the same time. I'm not interested in post-apocalyptic narratives that are dystopian and so forth, because we've done that. We have that particular deck of cards that we can draw on. But what we need now is we need hopeful narratives that provide us templates for building stuff, whether it be institutions, legal frameworks, ways of living our lives.
That guide and inform us how to adapt to that change and what to aim towards and what to build and what to look forward to and what to strive for and what to aspire for and what to dream for.
Yeah, absolutely. And they can't be based on a prediction. We can't, like Elon Musk, say, well, we will build a second home for humanity and move to Mars. And we can't say that we will develop a magical technology that fixes global warming. And we can't say that global warming will overwhelm us or that society will collapse or any of these things. We have to speak forward into uncertainty and say, this could happen, this could happen. But more importantly, I hope this happens. I want this to happen, and give ourselves directions.
And maybe this should happen, right?
Yes.
Not only what is and will happen, but what should happen.
And there's a very important concept in Foresight called the aspirational future, the future that you aspire to. We have, and we're developing more techniques for taking an aspirational future and then building the roadmap to get there. Always understanding, as with any plan, that things will change along the way. But if transition design can, and if the storytellers of the world can find new aspirational futures that converge in a way that we can all act together. We may not all have the same aspirations, but if they're close enough that we can agree on what to do, then the rest of the 21st century could be a very exciting place to live.
Yes, and you said that you're interested in that kind of future, and I'm interested in your next book, depicting and creating and imagining that kind of future for us all. So I'm very much looking forward to it. Karl, I'm afraid I can speak to you forever, as always, because I find it tremendously stimulating and very enriching, but unfortunately we're again out of time. So tell us quickly, what's the best place for people to find more about you and your work?
Well, I have a website at kschroeder.com. I'm also on Twitter. My handle there is just Karl Schroeder. So I try and keep people up to date through those venues. And I would encourage everybody to go out and look up transition design and be open to all the new generation of really exciting science fiction and fantasy writers out there who are imagining and aspiring in exactly the way that we've talked about, and who are richly deserving of attention. Isaac Asimov and the Foundation is just so 20th century. We have to get past it. And there's a lot of really good writers out there that that are doing exciting work right now that I hope will inspire people.
So it's time to move beyond Isaac Asimov's Foundation series and predicting the future and predicting history or future history, and sort of embrace the new generation of science fiction authors who are imagining and creating this kind of aspirational future. I would say you're definitely one of them. And that's why I always follow your work. So is that the parting message you want us to part ways today with? We've been talking today for over an hour about Strangemaking, COVID-19, and the importance of narrative a little bit. Is that the parting message? What do you want it to be?
I hope that people recognize the power of imagination at this point, and the unlimited possibilities that are ahead of us. When you feel walled in by the future, more often than not, it's because you don't recognize the blind spots of your own default future. So let's start knocking those walls down. And there's a lot of different ways to do it. Science fiction just being one of them. But strange make the world for yourself, and find the things that can change, and imagine that they will change, and have a little faith in the future, because we can build the one that we want.
Strange make the world for yourself, personally and collectively, and science fiction can help us start breaking down those walls that limit or keep us trapped into our normalized future. I think that's a fantastic message. Karl Schroeder, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you so much for having me, Nicola.
If you guys enjoyed this show, you can help me make it better in a couple of ways. You can go and write a review on iTunes, or you can simply make a donation.